Welcome to Cover, the World Affairs Councils of America's monthly author series. We've been bringing this to you since January 2014, so we're wrapping up our 9th year. I'm Bill Clifford, President and CEO of WACA, and this is a special treat for me that we are presenting Martha C. Nussbaum, who is one of the world's most influential living moral philosophers. Dr. Nussbaum is the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics, appointed in the Philosophy Department and the Law School of the University of Chicago. She gave the 2016 Jefferson Lecture for the National Endowment for the Humanities. That same year, she won the Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy, and then the 2018 Berggruen Prize in Philosophy and Culture, and the 2020 Holberg Prize. These 3 prizes are regarded as the most prestigious awards available in fields not eligible for a Nobel. I'm extremely humbled to be in your presence. Martha Nussbaum's work combines rigorous philosophy with insights from literature, history, and law. She's published more than 22 books on a wide range of topics, from tragedy and vulnerability to religious tolerance, feminism, and the role of emotions in political life. That last was the focus of her 2016 book, The Monarchy of Fear, which looked at the polarization of partisanship in the United States. On January 3rd comes Justice for Animals, Our Collective Responsibility, the subject of today's Cover to Cover. Martha Nussbaum, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Bill, very much. I'm so delighted to be joining you and your audience, and looking forward to taking more and more questions from the viewers.
Very good. And we will take questions in the chat box and the Q&A, and we also have very many that have been pre-submitted. I'm just going to ask if I may call you Martha, because...
Oh, of course. None of this...
We're just talking about being in Japan, and I feel like you are a sensei.
I mean, I'm humbled to be on your show, okay?
Very good. Well, here is the book, by the way. Yes. Justice for Animals, which I've just finished reading, and it is very accessible, very persuasive. And to get us rolling, Martha, I just want to say that life for animals is appalling. It's worse than ever. And I wonder if you can please set the stage for us about what mankind's responsibility is, where we've fallen short, the ethical evasions we've made to get us to this sorry stage.
Well, it's hard to know where to start because animals are in trouble all over the world. But let's start with the land. Habitats for animals are shrinking because partly of human overpopulation, partly because of the depredations of climate disasters, and animals just don't have enough space to live and forage. In the sea, things are much worse than you might think. That's one of the things that people don't always notice. Plastic is everywhere in the seas, and whales are choking on the plastic. I mean, here's a plastic bottle, I'm embarrassed to say, which our university gives out. But whales swallow those, and then they get so full that they can't eat food, and then they die of starvation. There's also noise pollution in the seas when oil companies are drilling and they send air bombs down to the floor of the ocean to chart it. That causes stress for animals. And the Navy sonar program has even been ruled invalid by a US court. But that's just in our coastal waters. Out in the deep seas, there's noise pollution everywhere. In the skies, there's air pollution. And then, of course, as many of you may know, migratory birds are always crashing into buildings. Our own law school building has glass all over. And last spring, a group of migratory birds just plummeted to the ground, having crashed into our building. So all of these things we could do more about, but we don't. And then I want to say a particular thing about animals that we raise for food. Now, I myself do not think we ought to be killing animals for food at all. I make an exception for fish, which I can talk about later, but anyway, that's me. But I think that most people would agree that we should not be torturing the animals that we eat. And the factory farming industry is a real horror show. The way that chickens, pigs, calves are raised. Pigs are very intelligent and social animals, but they're thrust into these gestation crates that are just the size of their bodies. They can't lie down, they can't turn around, they have no society, even though pigs are very social animals. And they have to defecate into these sewage lagoons under the gestation crate. So pigs are very clean. You think of pigs as dirty, but they're actually very clean, and they would never defecate near where they eat and sleep, but they have to. So it's a lifelong torture for these pigs. So that's the kind of thing that that industry does, and they are heavily invested in not letting us know much about it. So in a lot of states, there are these laws that prevent people from writing about it, from photographing it, and so on. So, you know, we have a lot to account for and a lot to clean up.
You have presented really the totality of domains, which also includes what happens in the home to our companion animals. And in that same sense of totality, we are all complicit, even perhaps the pet owners and the vegans. Can you explain why?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think all these problems could be solved if people really put their minds to it and got involved. It doesn't have to be a problem that affects you in your home to be a problem that you should be trying to clean up. But in the home, okay, companion animals, and I would rather not use the word pet because it suggests a little bit of condescension, a little that an animal is like a toy that you use. But I think, you know, some people treat their companion animals really well, but there are others who do think of them as kind of pets at their disposal. They adopt an animal during COVID, then when things get better, it doesn't suit them, they take it back to the store, just leave it off. But also, people think that these animals can just stay home without being really attended to. Most companion dogs do not get enough exercise, do not get enough attention. Cats are more self-sufficient, so they do a little bit better. But anyway, I think it's the decision to take into your home a companion animal is a life choice, rather like deciding to have a child. And one has to be prepared for the labor and the attention that it involves. I myself would like to have a dog, but I don't think that ethically I ought to have a dog because I travel a lot. I also have a condo that's rather small. So I don't feel that I could give this dog a very good home. I would have to hire dog walkers, and it just doesn't seem like a flourishing life to me.
We want to come back to that concept of a flourishing life. But I want to ask first about, or also to set the stage, since the title is Justice for Animals, we're basically going to proceed from the notion of injustice, and it's gotten much worse in the last few decades. Can you talk about why this is a question about injustice and justice, and is that why a philosopher has a role here?
Well, I think we have to start thinking, what are our most basic intuitions about injustice? So I start the book with a whole bunch of stories, and I try to bring people to the idea, which I think most of us have in some form, that injustice involves the wrongful thwarting of a sentient creature's striving to live well. And you can see that if an animal is just killed by a lightning bolt, that does not seem to be an injustice. But if it's trying to live and then it's thwarted by someone who's doing something wrongfully, they shouldn't be doing it, then I think we see that as injustice. It might not be malicious, it might be negligent. And I think a lot of our wrong to animals is sheer inattention and negligence. But anyway, that's the notion of injustice that I start out with. And then I ask, why should it be a notion for us rather than for all the sentient beings who are also trying to live well? They're also located on this earth. And, you know, I think each individual creature has a right to be where it is, but the animals have had their place taken away with no redress, no attention. And so I think they particularly are receiving injustice because people don't even realize that that's what they're doing. So yeah, I mean, I think a philosopher has a business here partly because we have to articulate better the question of injustice, but also partly because in law and in policy, there are theories that are philosophical, that are directing action, and I don't think that they're the right theories. So I want to propose the theory that I think is the right theory.
Okay, let's talk about the wrong theories, because you elaborate on 3 that are defective, and then we'll get to your theory, which you call the capabilities approach, or the framework is the capabilities approach. And so before we get to that, take us through these important 3 strands that look at, you know, human relationships with animals and why they don't satisfy you.
Well, the first, which is, some of you will have heard of it because it's very influential in litigation, is a theory that's been put forward by Stephen Wise, who's a legal thinker, who's the head of what's known as the Non-Human Rights Project. He goes to court on behalf of chimpanzees and elephants that have been wrongfully treated and so forth. What he says is that the worth of an animal and its status as a so-called person depends on its likeness to humans. So the more like a human this creature is, the better they do in terms of his theory. And he sees the world in this very conventional way as a ladder of nature where we're at the top and other creatures manage to get a little bit close to us, namely apes, elephants, and whales. But okay, so what's wrong with that? I think he thinks that it's a theory that can persuade a lot of people, and that's why he uses it. First of all, there are really horrible sufferings of animals that theory just doesn't address, because pigs and chickens are deemed not to be like enough to us. But second, why should we care about a creature because it's like us? It should be because of what they are, not because of what we are. And the very idea that we're at the top of some ladder seems to me quite questionable. There are animals who have sense perceptions that we lack. Birds can navigate by magnetic fields. We can't do that. Dolphins can figure out what's inside an object that they approach by echolocation. We can't do that. So anyway, there are lots of things that animals are better on than we are. I think they're often better at compassion than we are too. But anyway, so it's the wrong emphasis, I think. And then the thing is that he abandons all the other animals to the cruelties that await them. The second wrong theory turns this upside down. In a way, it's just it flattens the world too much rather than a ladder. We just have a flat plane. And this is the theory of classical utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Now, Bentham was a real radical, and I think did great good for this issue when he pointed to the sufferings of animals in Principles of Morals and Legislation in 1789. And he said, you know, this is a big moral issue, and that it's an issue that we should realize is the same for animals as it is for us. Pain is the one great bad thing in the world, and in respect of pain, we're all alike. Now, I think he was quite right in saying we're all alike in many respects, and right in saying pain is really, really bad and one of the bad things. So this will take us quite a long way. And in contemporary work, the philosopher Peter Singer has been one of the great radical supporters of animal rights, and all honor to Peter. But the problem is that pain is not the only thing in the world. You can imagine an animal living without pain, and I think in some humane zoos, there are lots of animals living without pain, but they might not have society. They might be lonely. These animals need often quite a lot of other animals in order to live well. A parrot probably only needs one other parrot, but a dolphin needs a large pod of other dolphins, and in a zoo you don't get that. And the other thing is they need room to move around, a lot of space. An elephant covers 200 miles a day, so an elephant in the zoo doesn't get that, but if they're born that way, they don't know what they're missing. So they have what economists like to call adaptive preferences. That is, preferences that are formed in reaction to the low level that you know about, that you think you can achieve. And then the other thing about the utilitarian approach is that its aim is a state. It's a state of satisfaction of preferences. But creatures don't just want to sort of loll around in a state of satisfaction any more than we do. We want to be agents. We want to create our own lives. And so I think the utilitarian theory doesn't make room for that. So then I think much better is the theory of my former graduate student, Christine Korsgaard, in her wonderful recent book, Fellow Creatures. It's a book that's based on the ideas of Immanuel Kant, but she rightly and quickly rejects Kant's actual views about animals. Kant thought that we could use animals like property and do anything we wanted, basically, with them. But she says that there are materials in Kant's philosophy that we can use, along with, I must say, a lot of materials from Aristotle, which is my starting point, to craft a good theory for the treatment of animals. Now, I think there are wonderful things in this book, and I agree with quite a lot of it. But toward the end, she kind of comes back to Kant, and she says that because human beings are the only creatures that are capable of self-regulation and deliberation about the sources of their behavior and their identity, therefore, not that they're better, she does not think humans are better, but that they are the only ones who can be active citizens, helping to craft the world. I would say animals are very active, and they do express what they think and what they want in many, many ways, some linguistic and some other kinds of expression. And after all, we can listen to them and we can figure out what they want in the way that we already do now with children with cognitive disabilities, and indeed aging people with cognitive disabilities. We understand their indications and we try to craft our treatment of them according to their expressed preferences. So I think she's too pessimistic about the communicative capabilities of animals, and she doesn't include them enough. So that's my one beef, but I admire her book quite a lot.
Just before we get to yours, you've left us at a good point, because also the science is better these days that elaborate, particularly your last point, that these animals, we know so much more about them and how they do communicate and that they have emotions, and so it's almost strengthening your argument that we have this, it's cruel not to use that knowledge.
Absolutely. We've learned so much in the last 30 years. I immersed myself in the science before I wrote the book, and I love reading it, and I love learning so much. So I put a lot of the science into the book. And that's another beef I have with Chris Korsgaard, that she really doesn't read the science. And so I think she just doesn't know what animals are capable of. So yeah, I think we now know that animals are very responsive to information, that they have complicated relationships with one another, they have complicated emotions, and so on. I mean, a lot of, even birds who were thought to be bird brains, but birds are some of the most intelligent and communicative. People thought that because they have no neocortex, they couldn't be very intelligent, but now people understand that through a separate evolutionary path, through different physiological structures, they came out with the same abilities. And some birds possess extremely complicated linguistic abilities, even syntactic complexity. So yeah, I love learning about animals, and I hope people who read my book will see a lot of those stories there.
Well, I'm going to ask our listeners and our viewers to pause just a moment longer before we get to your theoretical framework, because I should say also, the other important thing is this is not just an academic inquiry for you, it's very personal. And I'd like you to please share the inspiration and encouragement from your late daughter, Rachel, who I think contributed also to the formulation of your theory.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachel had been a PhD in history, but her passion for animals, and particularly for wild animals, marine mammals above all, so that's why there's a whale on my cover, took her back to school. She went to law school and became a lawyer for animal rights. She worked for an NGO called Friends of Animals in Denver, the wildlife division. And then, we talked a lot, and she really got me to see the urgency of these issues. And because she knew the law and I knew the philosophy, we then went to the Human Development and Capability Association, and we gave 4 papers together, which do, in fact, come into the book in some form. So yeah, she really educated me, and her passion inspired me. So when she got ill, I had already started to write the book, and she read some chapters of it and told me which parts she liked and which parts she didn't like and so forth, and which parts other people wouldn't like. And in the chapter on wild animals, she said, I like this, but a lot of people will not. Anyway, she then had, after transplant surgery that was initially successful, but then started to fail because the donor organ had a defect. She was about to go in for retransplant, but then had a fungal infection that could not be cured. And it was just terrible. She had been in the hospital and she got all the way to rehab, but then back in the hospital for 6 months. And then in December of 2019, she died. So we just celebrated her 3rd yahrzeit, the anniversary of her death. And she was just a wonderful, inspiring person and really changed my life. And then the fact that I was mourning, I started thinking, well, what am I going to do now? I really wanted to pour myself into this book and make it as rich as possible, as compelling as possible. So, I just worked and worked on the book because I thought, well, she's gone, but her commitments and her ideas, what she cared about, still lives, and she can live within those things.
I'm sorry she's not here to celebrate this with you. I hope that you will no doubt inspire so many with this work. Talk about the theory that you find effective here and how that will be a basis for direct action.
Okay, so the theory is called the capabilities approach, and it was developed initially both by the economist Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in 1998, and me, and we develop in somewhat different ways. But the basic idea initially was to think about humans in developing countries and to think about what the right way of measuring how well they're doing would be. The idea would be that it's not by GNP per capita, not by just utility, so we were very critical of utilitarianism already, but instead by the opportunities that each person has to do things of meaning and significance. So the central question is, what is each person actually able to do and to be? And so it came into the human development reports of the United Nations, because now they measure people on a lot of different parameters: health, education, all the different things that people want to do, not just one single measure. So I thought this is a good starting point for thinking about animals, because animals also want to do and be things. And when we ask, what should each animal do and be? Well, for humans, I created a capabilities list that's kind of like a template for constitution making. I suggest that for animals, we can do the same, although it can't be an actual constitution because the world isn't ready for that. And anyway, animals aren't located in one nation, but it's a virtual constitution. We can think, what opportunities should each animal have? And my basic idea is that each kind of animal should, and the individuals in that kind, should have the opportunity to live a sufficiently flourishing life up to some reasonable threshold level in accordance with the characteristic behavior of that kind of animal. So it's much better, I think, than the so like us theory that I started out with, because it gives something for all kinds of animals. And it's better than the utilitarian theory because it includes many different things that creatures want, not just freedom from pain, but society, but agency, and so on. So anyway, I spend a lot of time adapting it suitably for animals and talking about the fact that we want to make sure that there's enough room within the account of each species for different individuals to have different choices, because animals are, in fact, individuals. So it's not right to think of the dolphin form of life, but we have to have one that includes room for opportunities for individual dolphins who are all different one from another. So anyway, that's what I do for a lot in the book. And I try to explain that I think the crucial sort of line in nature is sentience. That is the ability to feel pain, but also to see the world from a point of view. So I include in my theory all animals who have that, which does include fish, but it doesn't include insects, for example. So
Oh, it doesn't. Okay.
does not well, I mean, there's doubt about that. So I think we all have to be open-minded, but up till now, I think apart from some rather controversial experiments with bees, insects are not included. And some crustaceans may not be included either. So that's the disputed part, but definitely does not include plants. Now, plants, are very important. They're important for human lives. They're important for animal lives. But also, I think one could rightly think they're important in their own right in some ethical sense. But I don't think you can be a being in the theory of justice unless you're striving for something that's meaningful to you, and that does require sentience. So plants are just not part of my theory.
I got it, because I'm now struggling a little bit, because I think that it should be universal. And that particularly even to exclude, this is weird, to exclude insects like ants, for example, and crustaceans, these are social beings too, and they must want to flourish too. And even plants you might argue, have a way of communicating with each other. They may not be social, but they do support life. And so if we are thinking really fully about biodiversity, perhaps the theory can be extended. But I'm pushing gently on that, because somehow when you draw lines, you open up. That's why we don't address certain things with humans. We discriminate. We don't go to the full extent of universality, perhaps.
Well, look, I mean, if the insects were really what you say, if they were trying to do things and feeling emotions, then they would definitely come into my theory. But from science, so far, we've learned that their movements are rote, automata-like movements, and that they're not feeling either pain or any other sensation, and that they're not feeling emotions. So that's that, but that could change if our research changes. Plants similarly. So, it's partly an empirical question, but I think the criterion makes sense, because there are some parts of nature that feel, there's a someone in there. And that's who I'm talking about.
Okay.
Animals, where there's a someone at home in there really trying to do something.
Well, I appreciate that when you were sort of setting up the conversation in the book, that you named Virginia the elephant, Hal the whale, the Empress of Blandings for the sow, Jean-Pierre for the finch, and Lupa the dog, because I think that identity will draw in people, perhaps, who may not think enough about this, and that would include me. I mean, I don't spend my time thinking so much about the animal kingdom, and when you make it personal, I think you're right to lay the stress on animals as individuals and sentient beings.
Well, scientists now do that. They used to think animals were just automata, and so they didn't give them a proper name, and they thought, oh, that's sentimentality. But now, to recognize the fact that animals are complex individuals, they always give them proper names. And so Virginia was actually named by the scientist who was studying this particular group of elephants. Well, I gave that name to a whale, and I named him after a great whale scientist whom I've met. But Lupa was a historical dog, and I think people know, they do know that dogs and cats are individuals. So that was easier, actually. The Empress of Blandings is a fictional pig in P.G. Wodehouse. And I think P.G. Wodehouse is a wonderful, intuitive, empathetic author who was capable of the greatest sympathy with the thought processes of an animal. The way he imputes certain kinds of thoughts to the Empress is really, really nicely done. It's not done with simple anthropomorphism, because he understands that her main orientation is to her food, which she loves. She's a champion in the fat pigs class. Anyway, so it's just, I drew in that example because I wanted so much to show a pig that had great dignity and that was treated with love. And that world of Blandings Castle is really a world of.
Well, that's really fictional compared to the
Oh,
treatment
yeah.
of kids in our society and really across the world, as you state in the writing on food production and the cruelty
Oh, yeah.
therein. We are the naming of animals brings to mind, we name hurricanes after people. Might as well name animals as we do our companion animals. We're talking with Martha Nussbaum. She's a philosopher at the University of Chicago. Her book is Justice for Animals, Our Collective Responsibility. We're at the halfway point, and I do want to bring in questions from the audience, which I have several of. And since you mentioned animals in the wild, which may have been a point of controversy. I think you referenced that when you were speaking of your daughter, Rachel. Talk about the distinction. I mean, is there really a wild space, first of all, given how dominant humans have become on the planet?
Well, no, there isn't. There's no space in the land, sea, or air that is not controlled by human beings. And people who talk about the wild, they like to, I think it's partly romanticism, but it's partly just washing their hands of the problem. They think, oh, well, if we just leave the animals alone, they'll solve their own problem. But look, even what's called a wildlife refuge is a space within a nation, for example, Kenya, that is curated by humans and is fenced off in various ways from poachers and predators. They spray for tsetse flies, etc. And, the animals are under human control. So once we understand that every space in the world is under human control, then I think we have to face up to the question, what do we do? I think we need to take benign control rather than, as usual, malign control. And just as the guardians in these wildlife refuges do fence out poachers and try to spray for pests and tsetse flies, so too in the seas and in the air and so on, we need to protect animals from the damages that humans are doing. What it meant in one US court case that I talk about is invalidating the whole US Navy sonar program because it affected adversely, the legal term was adverse impact, the behavior of marine mammals. They weren't even feeling pain, but they were feeling heightened stress measured by their stress hormones. They were delaying reproduction, they were delaying migration, or migrating with reduced energy reserves. And so in 2016, the Ninth Circuit judged that under a law called the Marine Mammal Protection Act, this was an adverse impact covered by the act and the sonar program had to cease. But of course, there's a lot going on in the deep seas that no court right now is covering. Basically, international law is a void, although there are certain things that I talk about that are promising. So what we need to do is change that, get together, get our thoughts together. And if whales are going to survive at all, the International Whaling Commission, which originally grew up as a way of controlling the existence of whales that could be harpooned and used for food. So they didn't want them to go extinct. They wanted there to be enough of them. So they wanted maybe a temporary moratorium on harpooning, but their basic idea was that they ought to be eventually harpooned and used for meat, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a lot of the people on that commission don't think that, and they're trying to push it in the direction of a more humane policy, which ultimately I think would have to include stopping oil drilling companies from polluting the sea with noise that disrupts much more than the sonar program the lives of these whales. But anyway, they haven't gotten together because once they get tougher, then nations quit the commission. So Japan has recently said, oh, well, we're just going to quit the International Whaling Commission. So that's the trouble. If international,
I was going to ask about that. Is it so? In some instances, maybe in the sonar instance, it's a question of both law and enforcement.
Well, I think, if it's coastal waters, then we know who the enforcer is, and the problem still will be to get the law enforced. In this case, it was enforced, but in a lot of cases, laws regarding animals are not enforced. And if they're not enforced, then there's the issue of legal standing. to have standing to go to court, you have to be, as a plaintiff, someone who has suffered a particular injury. Well, how does a human being show that that human being has suffered a particular injury by the fact that animal laws are not being enforced? So there's that problem, perpetual problem, which has held up the enforcement of laws. Animals have always been denied standing. Congress could do that if it wanted to, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. There are 4 countries in the world that have given animals standing to be plaintiffs in court. And of course, it doesn't mean that the animals are going to walk into court and like children.
Those countries?
Well, the countries are Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, and India.
Very interesting.
Well, it just happened out of a particular history. In Colombia, the fact was that Pablo Escobar loved animals, and he brought to Colombia a lot of animals that didn't belong there historically, but then they did very well there. Hippos reproduced wildly, and the parliament was going to put all the hippos to death. But the legal regime said that no, the hippos could come into court as plaintiffs to challenge this total holocaust of hippos, and they won. So anyway, that's how that happened. And in India, it happened from a case involving circus animals, and animals then were held to be persons under the meaning of Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which makes it a crime to deprive any person of life and liberty without due process of law. Makes it unconstitutional, I should say. So anyway, these things happen out of a particular history, out of a particular set of litigation. But anyway, those countries have done it. The US has at least allowed expert witnesses to go from the US to Colombia to testify in that case. And in doing that, they kind of said favorable things about that litigation. Some people took that as a gentle step in favor of allowing standing for animals, but nothing much has happened yet. But of course, animals have to be, first of all, protected by laws before they can go into court to challenge the non-enforcement of the law. And the problem is that we have a lot of very good laws, but they have gaps. So the big gap is the animals we eat. The Animal Welfare Act, which is a very old federal law, passed, I guess it was basically in the 50s, sometime in the Eisenhower presidency. And that's a very good law, which regulates the amount of water an animal needs when it's in transit and all kinds of detailed things. But it has been said from the very get-go not to apply to animals that we use for meat. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, a wonderful statute, but you can see from its name, it protects migratory birds. It doesn't protect chickens and other birds that we eat. So it's those carve-outs that mean that those animals are totally unprotected. The US is rather unique in this respect. A lot of European countries have much better animal protective laws than we do. And I think, it's an economic and political issue. The factory farming industry has enormous political power, and it always gets a stranglehold on Senate confirmations. Before somebody can be confirmed to a Senate an appointment that requires Senate confirmation, they always have to sit down with the American Farm Institute and say the right things. And boy, anyone who would run for higher office, and this is partly a problem of the Iowa primary, which may change now that the sequence of the primaries has changed. You have to go to Iowa, pose for photo ops with a pork sausage in your hand. So the whole pig industry in Iowa has disproportionate influence over our national life. And animal-friendly politicians like Cory Booker don't get very far in that process. And I think he's been, very frank about his both vegan practice, but his very favorable view of animal protective laws. And I think that gets him enemies.
Linda Kurtz is asking, is there an animal legal society, a legal group that advocates and challenges for animals here in the US and throughout the world?
Yeah, there are a bunch of different things. So the whale case that I talked about, the plaintiffs in the case were the National Resources Defense Council, NRDC, So that's one group that advocates for animals. The Humane Society of the United States has done very good litigation about puppy mills and about these laws that forbid you to divulge the conditions in the factory farm industry. But there is also the Animal Legal Defense Fund, which does other kinds of legal work. So there are many different groups. And then there are, of course, NGOs that themselves can be legal plaintiffs. And my students are trying to forge new ground themselves. So I have these wonderful law students, and one of them just told me that she had accepted a job with a large Chicago law firm, but on condition that she would begin for that firm a pro bono project involving litigation on behalf of animals. So things are happening, and I'm very excited to see what these idealistic and very skilled young lawyers will do.
Is the going back to the food food capitalism, big meat, is there an inconsistency in the morality that you're talking about with any kind of meat eating? I mean, I can't envision a legitimate challenge to those powerful interests. And we see synthetic foods happening, and there are so many ways to get protein. That should go to fish too, perhaps.
Okay, well, first of all, I do think that a big change is coming, because it's not just the soy-based meat, but it's now meat grown from stem cells, which is soon being marketed in the US. It's already been marketed in Singapore. And this is so-called real meat. It's just without killing. So that's exciting. But then I think to go further, I think lots of people can agree that the practices of the factory farm industry are horrendous. But what about humanely raised meat and animals that get to live a pretty good life? Well, we have to ask, what is the harm of killing? And, it's a controversial philosophical question, actually. Is death really a harm? Length of life might not be the main thing we should think about. So anyhow, my own view is that death is a harm because it interrupts activities and projects that extend in time that are meaningful to that being. So that means that a creature who either no longer has any projects at all, or whose projects are just all done, might not be so harmed by death. Now, my grandmother was 104 and she still had plenty of projects, so it doesn't have to do with calendar age. But anyway, I think there are creatures who live in the moment. And there might be even some human beings with disabilities for whom that's true. A child with an anencephalic child might not be conscious enough to be harmed by death. But anyway, fish live in the moment. Most creatures do not. They have a sense of time and they have projects extending in time. But up till now, anyway, it looks like fish are not like that. They just live in the moment. So that means if a fish grows to adulthood, which of course I think is crucial, and then gets a chance to live a characteristic fishy life for a while, and then is killed really painlessly, not by line fishing, which is very painful, but for example, by being conked in the head by a mallet. There's a very good book by Jonathan Balcom that describes truly humane ways of killing a fish. Anyway, that to me would be okay. So up till now, I still eat fish because at my age, I need 71 grams of protein a day to do all this athletic stuff that I do. And I can't digest lentils, so I have a problem here. And I do think that actually eating humanely raised fish and humanely killed fish is a lot better than the dairy industry, which is always very cruel. And the egg industry can be reformed, and cage-free eggs are available, and they're even making a profit. But the dairy industry, the problem is that to reform it would mean to not have a calf taken from its mother and the mother deprived of its calf. And you can't imagine what a profitable dairy industry would be like if they had decent lives. So I think the dairy industry is pretty bad. And so where are you going to get your protein. And so I think fish are somewhat better than that. But everything
Well,
is.
you're an educator. You're an educator as well as a thinker. And I have to say about my own experience as a pescatarian, I am someone who spent years and years in Japan, enjoying all kinds of fish and sea creatures. It was when I saw how octopi are killed that I had to stop eating taco, which is, nice on sushi, nice when it's, grilled. But when you see the tentacles grabbed and the body bashed against a wall or whatever, it's off-putting enough to say, I can't support that. And how do you educate? Where do we start educating our children about food choices, which doesn't seem to be high on the list of academic subjects in grade school? And when more generally, can we see a reform in the way of how we educate young people about issues that you raise in your book?
That's a really great question. And by the way, I don't include octopus in what I said about fish, because they do have a sense of time, and they're very complex emotionally. Octopi have complex emotions. But yeah, I think, well, we have so many resources at our disposal now that we didn't have before. Before, you had to take a child on a trip to the zoo, and you wouldn't see animals living as they really live. You would just see some fake behavior that the zoo brings about. But now we have videos and films of all kinds. Now there has to be selection. And, there's some bad films. I think my octopus teacher, even though the photography is wonderful and what it shows about the octopus is great, I think ultimately it's a pretty bad film because it's very narcissistic. It's all about the filmmaker's own spiritual journey and his midlife crisis. But there are plenty of films that you can find that show how wonderful nature is, and books. I mean, scientists are good writers, and they write these great picture books that you can show to children and learn a lot. And then you can take the child on a whale watching boat if you're on the coasts. Can't do that in the heart of the country, but you can do other things. You can go and see pigs as they live on a real farm, a humane farm, let's say. And so there are many ways that children can be educated. And my daughter went on a whale watching boat first when she was about 7 years old in Massachusetts. And I guess maybe her passion for whales started there.
Pam Cooper of Hilton Head asks a broader question. How can a community work on recognizing that humans are not to dominate the natural world? Can we dominate?
Well, in so many ways. I do think that even with respect to dogs and cats, who are the best treated of animals, we have a long way to go. Just the way that we use the word pet of what they are. And we, at least now, at least in some places, we forbid pet shops to sell animals that are bred on puppy mills. So that puppy mills are a terrible form of domination, because these breeders that produce animals that exist in a miserable condition and have lots of diseases, they look cute because they're puppies, and they're sold in pet shops before people realize the background and how many diseases they have. So, that is a problem that Chicago got on top of by passing laws saying you cannot sell a new animal. You have to adopt an animal, and it has to be a certified shelter animal. And then the puppy mill producers, who are mostly in Missouri, said, oh, well, here are some new shelter organizations. And they repackaged the puppy mills as a shelter organization. But Chicago caught up to that, passed the law saying it has to be a recognized one with certain credentials. So now in Chicago, you can't buy a dog that's been abused in this puppy mill industry. So, the people who want to exploit animals are very powerful, and they're very resilient. So you have to be keeping constantly up with them. The Chicago Bar Association has a whole group that works on animal issues like the puppy mill issue. And, it takes a lot of people to keep up with that. And then what about once the animals are in the house? What about abuse there? Well, what I think each city should have, we now have the Department of Child and Family Services in Chicago. Every city has something like this. And I, as the member of a university that does certain projects involving young children, I'm a mandatory reporter. That is, if I see any human child out in the cold without proper clothing or something else that indicates abuse, I'm required by law to report that right away to the Department of Child and Family Services. I think there should be something similar for animals. If you witness abuse right away, you are required as a reporter, because you live in a city with many kinds of animals, to report that. Now, of course, such departments are scandal prone. They don't always do their job. We all know this, but at least it's dignifying the problem by creating an agency whose duty it is to uphold these laws against animal cruelty. So, I think domination takes so many forms that we can't, it's like a Hydra head, you try to push one down and another springs up. So you have to be vigilant and resourceful and informed, but I think we can do that.
Since you referred to cities there, Susan Danielson of Portland, Oregon asks if human animal cities can coexist with animals. We're seeing all this urbanization here and around the world. That's part of it, I guess, to have that kind of agency, but what else can happen to better achieve the kind of goals you have in mind?
Well, I think a lot of education. There are lots of kinds of animals living in our cities that never lived there before. Coyotes in particular, I know quite a bit about. And of course, at first people thought, oh, those are pests. They're going to hurt children. They're going to eat your chickens and so on. But actually, that meant they didn't know much about coyotes because they're very shy and they will not, unless they're confronted, they will not approach humans. So education. And now I'm happy to see that coyotes in Chicago are treated quite well. And if one is cornered someplace, they simply relocate it very gently to a different place. The same thing is true of other creatures who live in cities. Now, we have to probably talk about the ones we don't like. We shouldn't just talk about the ones that are attractive. But what about rats and mice? Now, I do think that any
celebrated in Asian cultures as part of the
good policy has an exception for self-defense, sure. So there's nothing terribly wrong ethically with killing rats who are in your house, but there's a much better way. And just as most self-defense laws require you, as it were, to retreat before you kill, I think the right policy with rats and mice is sterilization, which some cities are already doing. And then that puts the problem to rest, because if the rats can't breed, they're not going to cause this problem. So that's a little more difficult than just putting out poison, but it's a lot better, I think, and healthier too for the city, because rats, of course, are the poison that gives rise to various diseases. So yeah, I mean, there are many problems, but we have to think, do we really need to kill the animal? Probably not. Probably there's some other more humane alternative.
Well, rats in the cities is also a reflection of our own occupation, the human presence.
Yeah, but it's also a reflection of bad sanitation policies.
That's true. Yeah.
I was just in Rome, and they don't have rats so much. They do have them, but they particularly have seagulls. And the seagulls, because people put out garbage the night before in flimsy bags, the seagulls are at it and they eat. But everyone agrees that it's a failure of public administration. And so
in Tokyo, it's crows.
Oh, is it?
Crow problem, yeah. Patricia Baxter of Norfolk has a question. It's, can you discuss the role of wildlife trade in animal declines? And that might also give you an opportunity to expound a bit on the distinction of extinction.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that I don't think that a species is the sort of thing that can be wronged. A species is an abstract entity, and even biologists don't believe in species as such anymore. But I do think that for an animal, an individual animal to flourish, it needs a group, and a pretty large group, so that the question of extinction ultimately is one that I'm concerned with, and the question of habitat. I think that the poaching and the ivory trade and so these have been terrible for the populations of animals, elephants in particular. Elephants have even started to evolve with no tusks because those elephants don't get killed. This is a very interesting development. But anyway, the ivory trade, and by the way, there is a very good film about that called The Ivory Game. I recommend that to anyone. And that, I think, is something that even, let's say, kids in high school should see, because it shows how brutal it is to the elephant communities, but also then how the various devices by which the countries that sell ivory mask that, and they market it as old ivory when it really isn't, and the impotence of nations who are not willing to really do what is required, namely burning all the ivory and so forth. So anyway, that's one instance. But the poaching for animals that go into zoos is another problem. The organization my daughter worked for litigated a case where there were 18 elephants. This was written up in the New York Times Magazine some time ago. And this was a group of animals called the Swaziland 18, who were animals who were said to be in a drought-ridden area in Swaziland. But actually, that was false. That was just a species cover-up. And they were put on a plane and taken in the dead of night to zoos in the United States. Now, this organization, Friends of Animals, got an injunction against that, but it was too late because the animals had been smuggled out in the dead of night and they were already in the United States. And zoos want elephants. They're very popular. A lot of the zoos in the United States are not nonprofits, they're for-profit zoos. Elephants make a profit, and the best of all is a baby elephant. So if you can snatch your baby from its mother, it's much easier than taking the whole herd, right? And so a lot of that is smuggling of baby elephants. And that's really a terrible thing, because think about that baby. Elephants learn, like many animals, as we now know, not by genes, but by social teaching. They never learn then how to be an elephant because they don't have need a group of females, pretty large group, maybe at least 6 females. And that elephant will never learn how to be an elephant. There's also the same kind of predation when it comes to whales and orcas. The film Blackfish, a great expose of the orca who killed its own trainer, but the reason for that was that orca had been ripped away from its group when it was very, very young. It never learned orca behavior or ways of life, had no community and no moorings, and then it reacted with aggression. So that's the kind of thing that this. Fortunately, SeaWorld is no longer keeping orcas, so protest makes a difference.
Martha, we're coming up on 3 o'clock, but I have 3 or 4 questions, which would be great for our video recording. Would you indulge us, or do you have a hard stop? I'll respect
a few minutes, because I have, unfortunately, another podcast at 3.
Okay, so very good. Short question. Thank you. Short question. Should zoos exist in the 21st century?
I think for some animals, they're fine. The test should be, can it give animals enough space and enough numbers of their own kind to have a decent society? And so if they do that, then it's okay. I think for some apes and some monkeys and for some birds and so that's okay. Elephants, whales, orcas, dolphins,
tigers,
no. Tigers, no.
Yes. Chloe Thomas. Some animals are revered for their remarkable abilities in conflict contexts, such as drug dogs, search and rescue, war, even as they are put in very dangerous situations to do those jobs. In these situations, do you find they're being treated with equality, respect, and dignity, or are their lives being devalued?
You get every possible thing. I'm not totally against animals working, because I think there are many cases where we see that the animal takes pride in its work, and if treated well, is pleased to do it. And just like a hunter-jumper horse is excited, like an athlete, to be able to go over the jumps. But, they're certainly not all treated that way. One book I particularly like is a book called Elephant Company by a man who really understood elephants greatly. And he worked with them, first of all, in log rolling in Burma, but then during the Second World War, they could do war-related work. But this man was so empathetic and so gentle with the elephants that he was exemplary. But elephants are usually very abused and exploited in the work that they do. So yeah, I mean, it all depends. And I think that dogs can be treated really well and can do their work well, but they have to be treated with sufficient respect.
I'm going to combine two questions for efficiency. One comes from my colleague, Kayla Ryder, and the other from Juliet Booth. And they relate in part to your most previous book, your most recent book, which is The Monarchy of Fear, but also Injustice for Animals, the one that's coming out next month. The word of this year, 2022, is gaslighting. And in this day and age of gaslighting and heated online debates, how can we have a genuine civic conversation about the impact of humans on wildlife? That's my colleague. And Juliet, are you optimistic about the future for justice for animals?
Well, you know, I think this is one area where so far we can have a dialogue that's not poison, because people love to learn. And they love to learn about the new research on animals. So I think if we lead with learning, and of course, I'm very emphatic that it has to be good scientists and fact-based learning, but then we at least have a parameter to go forward with. And I think I'm optimistic because we are learning so much more and people are excited about it. And I see so many young people who really want to go out and change things in many different ways. And I think there are 1,000 ways that people can help here, just by publicizing something, by doing legal work, by doing philosophical work, but also just by donating to or supporting and working for organizations that are doing wonderful work. And in the book, I just give a long account of the different ways people could join in, because I think there's so many ways. And I do think we're seeing progress in the laws we're getting, and uneven, but it's going forward.
And for my part, reading and talking and choosing to eat certain ways, I have to say, as I did before we started our program, that of the 9 years worth of cover to cover, which means more than 100 episodes of this monthly series, we have never focused on animals. We've focused on China, Russia, the Middle East, terrorism, nuclear weapons, poverty, many important things, climate change, of which biodiversity is part of it. And of course, we just had the biggest biodiversity confab in Canada this last week. But we've not talked about it on cover to cover. And I feel guilty, but this is a start, maybe not too little, not too late to get going. I'm wondering if you can talk about the broader literature that your book now is, and this isn't even your first effort at justice for animals. You had another book that got into it several years ago. What's the literature like?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is the scientific literature is enormous and very, very, they know how to speak to a broad audience, and that's what they're in the business of doing. So if you read a good book, the likelihood is that the author of that book, whether it's Mark Bekoff, who writes about animal emotions, or Carl Safina, who writes wonderful things about animal society, Frans de Waal, one of my favorites, who's a wonderful speaker, who writes particularly about apes, but about peacemaking and conflict resolution in animal societies. They're all great people to read and to talk to. Philosophers don't write so well, but there are some who write really, really well. And I would particularly recommend a husband-wife team, Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, who have a book, Zoopolis, which is about the whole issue of animal-human cities and animals as citizens, but particularly focusing on companion animals. And they're really great, and they're very nuanced, and I think speak very, very clearly. And I found that my students, who were law students, who were not philosophy graduate students, particularly resonated to that book.
Very good suggestion. And you are an excellent writer. You don't need me to say that. You, Martha Nussbaum, are the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics, appointed in the Philosophy Department in the Law School of the University of Chicago, author of Justice for Animals, which I highly recommend. You can pre-order it on your normal channel. It's out January 3rd. Happy holidays to you, Martha. Thank you so much for joining us on Cover to Cover, and to all the audience who had joined us today and who will see this recording. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Bill. I really enjoyed this enormously, and thanks to everyone who tuned in.
I enjoyed it too, Martha. Good day.
Good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.